Ube ego, the elderly woman hissed in Russian, pointing at the weeping waiter kneeling in shattered glass. Kill him. Jaden, the city's most feared mafia boss, didn't blink. He simply nodded to his armed guards. The restaurant manager hyperventilated, oblivious to the foreign death sentence, before a weapon could be drawn. A calm, steady voice pierced the suffocating terror. Proshu proshchenia, Sudarinya, Stella said, stepping directly into the crosshairs with a crisp linen napkin. Ito, Nasha Oshibka, no krov isportit vash appetit. Forgive me, madam. It was our mistake, but blood will ruin your appetite. The waitress had spoken. The furious Russian mother froze, and the untouchable mafia boss finally looked up. The rain had been falling since 3 in the afternoon, a steady, relentless downpour that turned the city streets into slick, mirrored surfaces, reflecting the neon glow of the high-end district. Inside Laura, the atmosphere was usually a sanctuary from the urban chaos, a hermetically sealed bubble of jazz, truffles, and quiet, expensive conversations. Tonight, however, the air felt thick, charged with an invisible, suffocating static. Stella stood by the polished mahogany service station, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of a silver serving tray. Her feet ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm that traveled all the way up her calves, a physical reminder that she was on hour 9 of a double shift she had desperately begged the floor manager for. The eviction notice sitting on her small kitchen counter at home didn't care about her exhaustion. It only cared about the numbers in her bank account, numbers that were currently dangerously close to 0. She adjusted her pristine white apron, smoothing out non-existent wrinkles, trying to focus on the soft clinking of silverware rather than the mounting anxiety in her chest. It was a Tuesday night, which typically meant a slow, manageable crowd of junior executives and weary travelers from the nearby luxury hotels. But 20 minutes ago, the restaurant's atmosphere had undergone a violent, invisible shift. The general manager, a usually composed man named Richard, had sprinted out of his back office with a complexion the color of old parchment. He had frantically waved the staff together, his hands trembling so violently his clipboard rattled. He didn't give them a speech. He didn't give them a pep talk. He only gave them a name, whispered with the kind of reverence usually reserved for vengeful deities. Jaden. The name hung in the air, instantly dropping the temperature in the room. Every server, busboy, and host knew the stories. They were the kind of urban legends whispered in the breakroom stories of rival businesses burning to the ground, of men vanishing into the harbor, of a shadow empire that operated entirely above the law. And now, the architect of that empire was coming to dinner. Stella watched through the towering, floor-to-ceiling front windows as the motorcade arrived. It wasn't loud or flashy. There were no screeching tires or shouting men. It was a procession of 3 identical, pitch-black SUVs that glided to a halt at the curb with terrifying precision. The rain seemed to bounce off their heavy, armored frames. Before the vehicles had even fully stopped, the doors of the lead and trailing cars opened simultaneously. Men in dark, immaculately tailored suits stepped out into the downpour, completely ignoring the rain soaking their shoulders. They moved with a chilling, synchronized efficiency, their eyes scanning the street, the rooftops, and finally, the windows of the restaurant. They weren't just bodyguards, they were soldiers. Stella felt a cold shiver trace the line of her spine. She had seen wealthy men before, politicians and celebrities who demanded attention. This was different. This was power that didn't need to ask for attention because it already owned the ground it walked on. The door of the middle SUV opened. An umbrella was deployed instantly, shielding the occupants from the weather. Jaden stepped out. He was taller than the rumors suggested, moving with a predatory grace that seemed entirely out of place in the refined setting of the restaurant. He wore a charcoal overcoat that draped perfectly over his broad shoulders. his face a mask of absolute, unreadable calm. But it wasn't just him. From the sheltered interior of the vehicle, he offered his hand to an older woman. She stepped onto the wet pavement with the slow, deliberate movements of royalty. She was draped in a heavy mink coat despite the mild chill of the autumn evening, her silver hair pulled back into a severe, elegant knot. Even from a distance, Stella could see the sharp, critical gleam in the older woman's eyes. She surveyed the glowing facade of Laura, not with anticipation, but with the weary disdain of a monarch inspecting a muddy village. As the entourage moved through the heavy glass doors of the restaurant, the ambient noise in the dining room died. It didn't fade. It was severed, as if someone had pulled a plug on the entire establishment. Diners stopped chewing. Forks hovered midway to mouths. The soft jazz playing over the hidden speakers suddenly sounded painfully loud. Stella pressed her back against the service station, trying to make herself as invisible as possible. She watched as Richard, sweating through his expensive suit, practically bowed as he led the party to the prime corner booth, a secluded, heavily shadowed alcove that offered a full view of the room while keeping its occupants obscured. The men in suits fanned out, taking positions at adjacent tables and near the exits, their presence effectively hijacking the entire dining room. Stella let out a long, trembling breath, her eyes locked on the corner booth. She desperately hoped she wouldn't be the one assigned to serve them. She just wanted to survive the shift, collect her tips, and go home. But as she watched her young, inexperienced co-worker, a boy barely out of his teens, being pushed toward the table by a frantic manager, Stella felt a sickening knot form in her stomach. The night was just beginning, and the air was already heavy with the scent of an impending disaster. From her vantage point, near the glowing, amber-lit bar, Stella watched the slow-motion train wreck unfold at table 42. Her co-worker, a sweet but terribly anxious college student named Thomas, looked like a lamb walking into a slaughterhouse. His hands, gripping the leather-bound menus, were shaking so noticeably that the gold-tasseled bookmarks vibrated against the covers. Stella felt a deep, empathetic pang in her chest. She knew that fear. It was the visceral, animalistic terror of being trapped in a small space with apex predators. She wiped down the marble counter of her station for the 4th time, her eyes darting back to the corner booth every few seconds. She needed to focus on her own tables, a lovely older couple celebrating their anniversary, and a group of loud businessmen, but the gravitational pull of Jaden's table was impossible to ignore. The entire restaurant seemed tilted toward that shadowy corner, every breath drawn by the staff calibrated to avoid making a sound. Jaden sat with his back to the wall, a position that allowed him to survey the entire dining floor. He had removed his charcoal overcoat, revealing a tailored black suit that looked expensive enough to pay off Stella's debts 10 times over. He didn't look at the menu. He didn't look at the trembling waiter. His dark, impenetrable eyes scanned the room with the slow, methodical rhythm of a radar dish. He radiated a cold, terrifying stillness. There was no fidgeting, no casual shifting of weight. He was perfectly, completely motionless, which only made him seem more dangerous. Beside him, his mother was the exact opposite. She was a hurricane of subtle motion and vocal dissatisfaction. She had discarded her mink coat, handing it to one of the looming bodyguards without looking at him, and was now actively dismantling the restaurant's presentation with sharp, dismissive waves of her hand. Thomas managed to stutter out a greeting, his voice cracking on the word evening. Stella winced in sympathy. The older woman didn't even acknowledge his presence. She picked up the crystal water glass, held it up to the dim light, and then set it down with a sharp, echoing clack. She turned to Jaden and began speaking. The words hit the air like small, jagged stones. Stella recognized the cadence instantly. It was Russian, but not the casual, street-level dialect one might hear in the city's immigrant neighborhoods. It was a harsh, aristocratic, and fiercely demanding strain of the language. It brought a sudden, vivid rush of memories to Stella's mind. The smell of strong black tea, the sound of classical piano music, and the stern, uncompromising voice of her grandmother, a woman who had fled St. Petersburg decades ago, but had never let the elegance or the iron will of her homeland fade from her blood. Stella's grandmother had insisted, often with brutal strictness, that Stella learn the true language, the language of the old world, not just the bastardized slang of the new one. Ona Gryaznaya, the mother snapped, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the supposedly spotless crystal glass. It is dirty. Jaden didn't look at the glass. He simply looked at Thomas, who was now sweating profusely, clearly having no idea what was just said. Jaden's voice, when he spoke, was low, a gravelly baritone that didn't need volume to command absolute obedience. My mother says the glass is unacceptable. Bring a new one. Bring a new setting for the entire table. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't threaten, but the implication of failure hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Thomas practically fell over himself apologizing, frantically gathering the heavy silverware and glasses, his hands clashing the crystal together in a noisy, chaotic mess. The mother sighed dramatically, a harsh sound of pure contempt. Eti ljudi kak životnie, she muttered to her son, her eyes rolling. These people are like animals. Stella gripped her serving tray tighter, her knuckles turning white. She understood every word. She understood the deep-seated arrogance, the cultural isolation, the frustration of an older woman who felt entirely out of place and was taking it out on the easiest targets available. She watched as Jaden simply nodded to his mother, not agreeing or disagreeing, just acknowledging her complaint to keep her calm. He was managing her. Stella realized. The ruthless mafia boss was playing the role of a dutiful, patient son trying to appease a difficult parent. It was a bizarre, humanizing detail that briefly clashed with his terrifying reputation. But the humanity vanished the moment Thomas rushed back with the new settings. In his panic, Thomas bumped against the edge of the heavy oak table. The water pitcher he was carrying sloshed, and a single, heavy drop of iced water spilled over the lip, falling through the air in agonizingly slow motion, landing directly on the sleeve of the mother's silk blouse. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't just quiet. It was the absence of sound, the kind of stillness that precedes a devastating shockwave. The men in suits at the adjacent tables stopped eating entirely. Their posture shifted, shoulders squaring, eyes locking onto the offending waiter. The mother looked down at the dark, wet spot blooming on her silk sleeve. Her face went completely blank for a fraction of a second before twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated outrage. Thomas stood frozen, the heavy water pitcher still in his hand, looking like a man who had just realized he stepped on a landmine and heard the click. Stella's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew what was coming. She knew the exact words the mother was about to scream before the woman even opened her mouth. The tension in the restaurant reached a breaking point. The air stretched so tight, it felt like it was going to snap and shatter every window in the building. Stella took a step forward, leaving the safety of her station, driven by an instinct she couldn't completely articulate. The eruption was instantaneous. The mother shot up from the leather booth, her movements shockingly fast for a woman of her age. She didn't yell in English. The language of the country she was in was entirely insufficient for the magnitude of the insult she felt she had just suffered. She unleashed a torrential downpour of Russian, her voice carrying a sharp, metallic edge that sliced through the hushed dining room. Tu, nekompetentnu durak, tu isportil moju odesdu. You incompetent fool, you ruined my clothes. Her hands flew in wild, angry gestures, pointing at the dark stain on her silk blouse, and then pointing sharply at Thomas's pale, terrified face. The young waiter was completely paralyzed. His mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land, but no sound came out. He took a clumsy, desperate step backward, trying to retreat from the verbal onslaught, but his foot caught the edge of the heavy, rolling service cart he had brought with him. He stumbled, his arms flailing wildly as he tried to regain his balance. The heavy crystal pitcher slipped from his sweaty grip. Time seemed to dilate, slowing to a brutal crawl as Stella watched the heavy glass vessel tumble through the air. It hit the edge of the marble table first, sending a sickening crack echoing through the room before plummeting to the hard, polished stone floor below. The sound of the glass shattering was deafening. It exploded outward in a glittering wave of sharp shrapnel and icy water, splashing across the base of the table and soaking the cuffs of Jaden's immaculately tailored trousers. The mother shrieked, jumping back, pulling her silk dress away from the splash zone. But it was Jaden's reaction that truly terrified everyone in the room. He didn't shout, he didn't jump back. He simply slowly, deliberately lowered his hands to the table, placing his palms flat against the dark wood. The air pressure in the restaurant seemed to plummet. His dark eyes locked onto Thomas with a predatory intensity that was entirely devoid of human empathy. It was the look of a man calculating the exact amount of force required to snap a spine. At the adjacent tables, 4 men in suits stood up simultaneously. It wasn't a rushed movement. It was smooth, practiced, and deeply menacing. They didn't draw weapons, but their hands moved casually toward their waistbands, their bodies angling to create a physical wall around their boss. Richard, the manager, suddenly materialized from the back hallway, his face completely drained of blood. He sprinted toward the table, completely ignoring the broken glass crunching beneath his expensive Italian leather shoes. "Mr. Jaden, I am so deeply sorry," Richard stammered, his voice vibrating with raw panic. He physically threw himself between the bodyguard and the petrified waiter. "This is completely unacceptable. He's new, he's terrified. I will fire him immediately. The meal is entirely on the house. Anything you want." The mother cut him off, her voice rising an octave, completely disregarding the manager's desperate English apologies. "Kto on govorit? Poczemu on prosto stoit tam? Uvolit ego. Zastavego obirate to na koleniach." What is he saying? Why is he just standing there? Fire him. Make him clean this on his knees. She turned her furious gaze to her son. "Jaden, ti pozvolish I am tax nami obrashchatsya. Vi etum griaznom meste." Jaden, will you let them treat us like this? In this dirty place? Jaden's jaw tightened. A single muscle ticked in his cheek. He looked at Richard, his voice dropping to a low, quiet register that sent shivers down the spine of everyone within earshot. "My mother is upset. Your boy ruined her dress, and now there is glass on my shoes." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was nearly unbearable. "Fix it." The 2 words were not a request. They were a command carrying the weight of a death sentence. Richard was visibly shaking now, looking frantically between the furious Russian woman he couldn't understand, the terrifying Mafia boss, and the shattered glass on the floor. He dropped to his knees, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket, awkwardly trying to mop up the freezing water and sharp shards with his bare hands. Thomas began to sob quietly, a pathetic, broken sound that only seemed to agitate the mother further. She continued her tirade, her Russian growing faster, harsher, insulting the restaurant, the country, and the sheer incompetence of everyone breathing the same air as her. From the shadows near the bar, Stella watched the nightmare unfold. She saw Richard cutting his hand on a piece of crystal, a bright bead of blood blooming on his palm. She saw the bodyguard stepping closer, the threat of physical violence hanging over the table like a dark cloud, and she saw the mother, trapped in a cage of her own frustration, lashing out because she felt entirely misunderstood and disrespected. Stella knew that if this continued for another 60 seconds, someone was going to get seriously hurt. Jaden wouldn't tolerate the public disrespect, and his men were just waiting for a nod. Stella closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She thought of the eviction notice. She thought of the danger of stepping into the crosshairs of a cartel boss. But as she heard the mother use a specific, highly aristocratic Russian curse word, one her own grandmother used to mutter when she was deeply, profoundly distressed, Stella made her choice. She couldn't watch this anymore. She dropped her serving tray onto the bar counter with a soft thud, grabbed a fresh stack of thick linen napkins, and walked out of the shadows. Stella's footsteps were silent against the carpeted sections of the floor, but as she stepped onto the marble perimeter surrounding the VIP booth, the soft click of her sensible black shoes seemed to echo like gunshots. The dining room was frozen in a terrifying tableau. Richard was on his knees, bleeding slightly, while Thomas stood paralyzed, quietly weeping. The bodyguards had tightened their circle, their eyes instantly snapping to Stella as she approached. One of the men, a massive wall of muscle with a scar cutting across his eyebrow, stepped subtly into her path, his body language silently screaming at her to turn around. Stella didn't break stride. She kept her eyes lowered, just enough to show deference, but her posture remained perfectly straight, carrying the regal poise her grandmother had beaten into a posture with a wooden yardstick. She didn't look at the bodyguard. She didn't look at the terrifying Mafia boss. She kept her gaze fixed entirely on the older woman who was mid-breath, preparing to launch another furious volley of Russian insults at the weeping waiter. Stella slipped past the bodyguard, moving with a fluid, non-threatening grace, and stepped right to the edge of the shattered glass. She didn't look at Richard. She didn't offer a frantic, babbling English apology. Instead, she knelt gracefully, keeping her back straight, and began laying the thick, white linen napkins over the dangerous shards of crystal and the spreading pool of water. Then she spoke. "Proshu proshchenia, Sudaranya," Stella said, her voice soft but entirely steady, cutting through the heavy tension like a silver blade. "Eto bila nasha oshibka. Molodoj helovek novenki I on bil osleplen vašim prisutstvijem. Please forgive me, madam. It was our mistake. The young man is new, and he was blinded by your presence." The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The mother's mouth snapped shut with an audible click. The furious tirade died in her throat. She stared down at the waitress kneeling on the floor, her eyes wide with profound, unadulterated shock. The harsh lines of anger on her aged face suddenly went slack. It wasn't just that someone had spoken to her in her native tongue. It was the specific way Stella had spoken. It was flawless. The pronunciation was crisp, the grammar impeccable, and the cadence carried the unmistakable, melodic rhythm of the high society St. Petersburg dialect. It was a ghost of a language, a relic of a bygone era of elegance that the mother rarely heard anymore. Certainly not from a waitress in a rainy city halfway across the world. Jaden, who had been watching Richard bleed with cold indifference, suddenly snapped his head toward Stella. The terrifying stillness broke. His dark eyes, which had previously held the lifeless depth of a shark's, suddenly sparked with intense, dangerous curiosity. He looked at the top of Stella's head, studying the tight, professional bun of her dark hair, analyzing her sudden insertion into his controlled environment. The bodyguards shifted uneasily, looking to their boss for a command, unsure how to handle this bizarre interruption. "Choto ti skazala," the mother whispered, her voice stripped of all its previous venom, replaced by a fragile, trembling disbelief. "What did you say?" Stella carefully picked up the largest pieces of broken glass through the thick napkin, placing them onto an empty side plate. She kept her movements slow and deliberate, ensuring she didn't appear as a threat. She looked up, meeting the older woman's eyes directly, projecting deep respect and absolute calm. "Ja skazala, что my prishim nashi glubocejshie izvinenia," Stella continued, her Russian flowing like dark honey. "Mina okan zal vaše krasivoje platje, pozhaluista, pozvolte mne prinesti vam nemnogo gorjačej vodi s limonom. Jesli vi pozvolite, ja hoću predložit vam hašku nastoješkego haja. Neto, hto oni podajut zdes, a krepkogo kak doma." I said that we offer our deepest apologies. I am so sorry for your beautiful dress. Please, let me bring you some hot water with lemon for the stain. And if you allow me, I wish to offer you a cup of real tea. Not what they serve here, but strong. Like back home. The mother reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and gently touched the air near Stella's shoulder, as if trying to verify she was real. A slow, genuinely warm smile broke across her wrinkled face, completely transforming her from a furious tyrant into a nostalgic grandmother. "Tai govorish. Tai govorish kak moya mat," the woman said, her eyes glistening suddenly under the dim restaurant lights. You speak like my mother." Jaden watched the exchange, his mind working at lightning speed. He didn't interrupt. He watched the absolute shift in his mother's demeanor. The woman who had been seconds away from demanding a violent retribution was now leaning forward. Her entire body language softened, captivated by the waitress on her knees. Stella turned her head slightly, shooting a sharp, commanding look at the manager. "Richard," she said in English, her voice tight but quiet, "take Thomas to the back. Now, I will handle the table." Richard, still clutching his bleeding hand, looked at Stella as if she had just descended from heaven with wings of fire. He didn't argue. He grabbed the sobbing waiter by the arm and practically dragged him toward the kitchen doors, fleeing the scene. Stella stood up smoothly, holding the plate of broken glass. She hadn't looked at Jaden directly yet, but she could feel the heavy, oppressive weight of his stare burning into the side of her face. She had extinguished the immediate fire, but as she stood inches away from the most dangerous man in the city, she realized she had just stepped out of the frying pan and directly into the inferno. The terrifying vacuum of silence that had gripped the dining room slowly began to fill with the cautious, hushed murmurs of the other patrons. The immediate threat of violence had evaporated, replaced by a bizarre, captivating intimacy at the corner booth. Stella efficiently cleared the remaining damp napkins from the marble table, her movements precise and practiced. She could feel the heat radiating from Jaden's silent, imposing figure, but she forced herself to keep her attention locked on the mother. That was her shield. As long as the older woman was engaged, the wolves would remain at bay. "Kak tebya zovut, Milaya devushka?" the mother asked, leaning heavily on the table, her sharp eyes mapping every contour of Stella's face. "What is your name, sweet girl?" "Menya zovut Stella, Sudarinya," Stella replied softly, setting down a fresh, dry napkin in front of the woman. "My name is Stella, madam." "Stella," the mother repeated, rolling the name around on her tongue as if tasting it. She reached out and patted the back of Stella's hand with surprising gentleness. Her skin was cool and papery, the heavy diamond rings on her fingers cold against Stella's skin. "Odkuda u ciebie takový jazyk? Ty nepokhoz na ruskuju, no tvoji slova. Oni z prošlogo veka. Tak sejas negovoria dashe v Moskve." "Where did you get such language? You don't look Russian, but your words, they are from the last century. They don't speak like this even in Moscow anymore." Stella felt a familiar, dull ache in her chest. The memory of her grandmother's small, cramped apartment smelling of mothballs and boiling cabbage rose in her mind. Moja babushka, Stella answered, her voice softening instinctively. Ona is Leningrada. Ona perezhila blokadu. Ona всегда говорила, что язык это единственное, что у нас нельзя отнять. Она заставляла меня читать Пушкина вслух каждый вечер, пока мое произношение не стало идеальным. My grandmother. She was from Leningrad. She survived the siege. She always said that language is the one thing that cannot be taken from us. She made me read Pushkin aloud every evening until my pronunciation was perfect. The mother let out a sharp, dramatic gasp, her hands flying to her chest. The mention of the siege of Leningrad was a cultural touchstone, a deeply resonant chord of shared history and suffering. Gospodi, she whispered, her eyes fully welling with tears now. Tvoya babushka, Baila zeleznoi, zhenshinoi. Kak I ti, shtobi podoiti, ke etomustolu. Lord, your grandmother was an iron woman, as are you, to approach this table. For the first time since she had walked over, Stella allowed a tiny, genuine smile to touch her lips. Moja babushka baila strashny lubogo. Kato nakoditsia vi etoi komnate, Stella said in a dry, deadpan tone. My grandmother was more terrifying than anyone in this room. The mother stared at her for a second, processing the audacity of the statement, and then threw her head back and let out a loud, booming laugh. The sound shocked the room. The bodyguards visibly flinched. Jaden, who had been resting his chin on his folded hands, watching the interaction with narrowed, calculating eyes, shifted his posture. A microscopic flicker of amusement danced in his dark gaze, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. Eto pravda, the mother declared, wiping a tear from her eye, speaking to her son in Russian. Slishish, Jaden, eta devoshka, ne boitsia tvoik, tsepnik sov, une krov starogo mira. It's true, do you hear, Jaden? This girl isn't afraid of your guard dogs. She has the blood of the old world. Jaden finally spoke. His voice was a slow, deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. He spoke in English, his accent practically non-existent, smooth and deadly. I hear her, mother. And I see her. She is remarkably composed. Stella felt the breath catch in her throat. She had successfully charmed the mother, but the son was an entirely different equation. Jaden wasn't swept away by nostalgia or linguistic elegance. He was dissecting the situation, analyzing the exact mechanics of how a waitress in a cheap apron had just completely disarmed his volatile mother and bypassed his security detail. He was looking at Stella not as a person, but as a puzzle, or perhaps a highly effective tool. I will be right back with the hot water and the tea, madam, Stella said smoothly, quickly bowing her head and taking a strategic retreat. She needed air. She needed to get out from under the crushing weight of Jaden's stare. She turned and walked back toward the service station, keeping her pace even and unhurried. As she pushed through the heavy wooden swinging doors into the chaotic heat of the kitchen, she finally let out the breath she felt she had been holding for 10 minutes. Her hands began to shake violently. Richard was standing near the dish pit, pale and sweating, holding a makeshift bandage of paper towels against his hand. He looked at Stella with a mixture of profound gratitude and absolute terror. "Stella," he rasped, his voice trembling. "What did you say to them? What is happening out there?" "I'm brewing a pot of black tea," Stella said, her voice sounding unnaturally calm to her own ears as she moved to the hot water dispenser. "And Richard, don't send anyone else to that table. I'm serving them for the rest of the night. If anyone else goes near them, they are going to burn this restaurant to the ground." She picked up a pristine silver teapot, feeling the heavy, cold metal ground her. The immediate crisis was over, but the long, dangerous dinner had just begun. The rest of the dinner service proceeded with a strange, surreal fluidity. Stella moved back and forth between the kitchen and table 42, moving with the silent efficiency of a phantom. The chaotic energy of the restaurant seemed to part around her. The other servers gave her a wide berth, shooting her terrified, reverent glances as she carried silver trays laden with dry-aged ribeyes, roasted marrow bones, and delicate, truffled asparagus. The mother had practically adopted Stella. Every time Stella approached the table, the older woman would launch into rapid-fire Russian, asking about her life, complaining about the city's weather, and offering unsolicited, blunt advice about Stella's posture and lack of a husband. Stella answered politely, flawlessly playing the role of the respectful, cultured daughter the woman clearly craved. But beneath the warm, nostalgic chatter with the mother, a secondary, entirely silent conversation was happening. It was a high-stakes game of observation, and Jaden was the grandmaster. Every time Stella stepped up to the table to refill a glass or clear a plate, she felt his eyes on her. He didn't stare openly, not like his menacing bodyguards did. His scrutiny was sharper, more analytical. He watched how her hands never trembled when she poured the wine. He watched how she smoothly intercepted a bodyguard who had stepped too close to the table, directing him away with a subtle, non-verbal tilt of her chin. He was testing her, looking for the cracks in her armor. He was trying to figure out if her calm demeanor was a performance or an intrinsic part of her nature. As Stella leaned over to clear the mother's empty appetizer plate, Jaden spoke. He didn't use Russian. He used English, a deliberate choice to exclude his mother from the dynamic and isolate Stella. "You have exceptional situational awareness for a waitress," Jaden said, his voice low enough that it barely carried over the jazz music. He didn't look up at her. He was slowly swirling the dark red wine in his glass, studying the legs of the liquid as it clung to the crystal. Stella froze for a fraction of a second. She kept her eyes on the plate she was clearing. "Thank you, sir. It comes with the job. You have to anticipate what the table needs before they ask for it." Jaden let out a small, humorless sound that might have been a laugh. He finally looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The intensity was physical, like standing too close to a massive fire. Anticipating a request for more bread is one thing. Anticipating the exact emotional trigger to diffuse a violent escalation requires a different skill set. Where did you learn to read a room like that? Stella felt a cold bead of sweat trace a line down her spine beneath her uniform. She was dancing on the edge of a razor blade. If she showed fear, she was prey. If she showed too much confidence, she was a threat. She chose honesty, wrapped in a professional detachment. "When you grow up with nothing," Stella said quietly, stacking the heavy plates on her arm, "you learn very quickly how to read the moods of people who have power over you. It's a survival mechanism, sir, nothing more." Jaden's eyes narrowed slightly. He absorbed the answer, turning it over in his mind. He recognized the truth in it. It was the same primal survival instinct that had driven him out of the gutters and to the top of the city's food chain. He saw the faint, dark circles under her eyes, the worn soles of her sensible shoes, the slight tightening of her jaw when he mentioned her station in life. She was drowning in the mundane struggles of poverty, yet she possessed a psychological resilience that most of his highly paid enforcers lacked. The mother, sensing she was being left out of the conversation, tapped her fork against her plate. "Oh, kem vy shoshetis?" she demanded in Russian. "What are you whispering about?" "Nichego vajnogo, mama," Jaden replied smoothly in Russian, not breaking eye contact with Stella. "Ya prosto blagodaril etu zhenshkinu za I velikolepny service." "Nothing important, mother. I was just thanking this woman for her excellent service." The mother smiled, satisfied. "Ona chudo. Tai dolgen ubeditsia. Kto je nachalnik znает." Kto nas spasla ich zalkuju reputaciju segodnia večerom. She's a miracle. You must make sure her boss knows she saved their pathetic reputation tonight. I will make sure of it, Jaden promised. He turned his attention back to his meal, effectively dismissing Stella. But as she turned to walk away, she felt a strange, heavy sensation in her chest. The fear was still there, a constant, low-level hum of adrenaline. But there was something else mingling with it now. It was a terrifying realization that she had just been seen. For the first time in years, she wasn't just part of the furniture. A faceless server in an apron. Jaden had looked at her and seen exactly who and what she was. A survivor. And in his world, survivors were valuable commodities. Stella retreated to the service station, her heart hammering a heavy, erratic rhythm. She watched the table from the shadows, her mind racing. The dinner was winding down. The worst was over. But as she watched Jaden sip his wine, his dark silhouette cutting a sharp, dangerous shape against the glowing amber lights of the restaurant, she knew with absolute certainty that the consequences of her actions tonight were far from finished. She had played a dangerous game to save a terrified boy and her own shift. But by doing so, she had drawn the eye of the wolf. Dessert arrived in the form of a delicate, gold-leafed chocolate torte that the mother proclaimed was acceptable, which in her vocabulary was the equivalent of a Michelin star. The oppressive tension that had paralyzed the restaurant 2 hours earlier had melted away, replaced by the low, satisfied murmur of a successful evening. The bodyguards had relaxed slightly, their stances less rigid, though their eyes never stopped scanning the room. Stella approached the table with the final bill presented on a sleek black leather tray. Her legs felt like lead, the exhaustion of the double shift finally crashing over her like a heavy, suffocating wave. She just wanted to go home, lock her cheap, hollow-core door, and sleep for 3 days. As she placed the tray gently near Jaden's elbow, the mother reached out and grasped Stella's wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Tai oken horoshaya devushka," the mother said softly, her Russian carrying a tone of finality and genuine affection. "Tai napomnila min, što vi etom mire yeshke ostalas iz krasota I uvazhenie. Spasibo tebe. You are a very good girl. You reminded me that there is still beauty and respect in this world. Thank you. Dlaya menya ito baila chest, Sudarinya," Stella replied, bowing her head slightly. "It was an honor for me, madam." The mother turned to Jaden, her expression shifting from warm to fiercely commanding. "Jaden, eta devochka, slishkom umna, shtobi prinosit jedu vi etom otratitelnom meste, ona tebe nujna. Unes helesnu chrebet, zaberite, Jaden. This girl is too smart to bring food in this disgusting place. You need her. She has an iron spine. Take her." Stella felt the blood drain from her face. She tried to subtly pull her wrist back, but the old woman held firm. The mother wasn't suggesting a romantic entanglement. She was talking business. She recognized Stella's competence and was casually suggesting her son acquire her, the way one might acquire a rare painting or a highly effective weapon. Jaden didn't laugh. He didn't brush his mother off. He slowly pulled a heavy, matte black fountain pen from the inner pocket of his suit jacket and unclasped the leather billfold. He glanced at the total, a number that would have paid Stella's rent for 6 months, and wrote a number on the tip line that made Stella's breath physically catch in her throat. It was obscene. It was a small fortune. But he wasn't finished. He slid a heavy, thick, cardstock business card onto the table. It was entirely blank, except for a single, embossed phone number in the center. He placed a heavy, gold coin on top of the card. It bore no currency markings, only an intricate, stylized etching of a wolf's head. It was a token, a marker. Jaden looked up, bypassing his mother entirely, and locked eyes with Stella. The cold, analytical scrutiny from earlier was gone, replaced by a dark, heavy intensity that felt like gravity. "My mother is rarely wrong about people," Jaden said, his voice dropping to a low, quiet register that forced Stella to lean in slightly to hear him over the music. "She likes you. Personally, I don't trust anyone my mother likes. It makes me suspicious." He paused, letting the silence stretch, forcing Stella to hold his gaze. She didn't blink. She refused to show him the fear that was currently twisting her stomach into tight, painful knots. "But," Jaden continued, his eyes drifting down to the cheap, fraying fabric of her apron strings before rising back to her face, "I also pay very well for absolute competence. You read a volatile situation, bypassed my security, de-escalated a physical threat, and managed an impossible personality, all without breaking your professional composure or spilling a drop of tea." He tapped a long, elegant finger against the gold coin. "That is a rare operational skill set. It is entirely wasted in a place like this, serving steaks to men who don't even look at your face. You have a choice, Stella. You can take that tip, pay whatever debts are keeping you in those cheap shoes, and keep working double shifts until your back breaks. Or you can call that number. You step out of the shallow water. I need people who don't panic when the glass breaks. I need translators who understand what isn't being said. I need people who can walk into a room and command it with a whisper." Stella stared at the card. The embossed numbers seemed to vibrate under the dim lighting. She knew exactly what he was offering. He wasn't offering her a job as a secretary. He was offering her a position in his shadow empire. He was offering her a life built on violence, extortion, and blood money. But he was also offering her an exit. He was offering her a life where she would never have to look at an eviction notice again, where she would never have to ache with exhaustion just to survive another week. "I'm a waitress, sir," Stella managed to say, her voice tight, trying to build a wall of denial against the immense, terrifying temptation pulling at her. "I don't know anything about your business. You know how to survive," Jaden replied softly, his eyes completely flat and unreadable. "The rest can be taught." He closed the leather billfold and stood up. The movement was a signal. The entire restaurant seemed to exhale as his bodyguards immediately sprang into action, forming their protective perimeter. The mother stood, allowing one of the massive men to drape the heavy mink coat over her shoulders. She gave Stella one last warm smile, completely oblivious, or completely indifferent, to the terrifying moral crossroads she had just placed the young woman on. Jaden didn't say goodbye. He simply turned and walked toward the exit, his presence moving through the room like a dark, unstoppable tide, leaving Stella standing alone at the table, staring down at the gold coin and the blank card. The silence that descended upon table 42 was heavy and absolute, contrasting sharply with the sudden burst of nervous chatter from the rest of the dining room. As the patrons realized the storm had finally passed, Stella stood frozen, her eyes glued to the matte black card and the heavy gold token resting beside the staggering, life-changing tip Jaden had written on the receipt. The numbers on the paper danced in her vision. It was enough to clear her arrears. It was enough to buy her mother's expensive medication for a year without skipping a dose. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. But it was the blank card with the single phone number that anchored her feet to the floor. She slowly reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and picked up the gold coin. It was heavy, the metal cool against her skin. The etched wolf's head seemed to mock her, a silent promise of power and danger. She slipped it into the deep pocket of her apron, its weight pulling down the fabric, a physical reminder of the offer on the table. She picked up the card, the thick cardstock feeling abrasive against her thumb. Her mind was a chaotic whirlwind of conflicting instincts. The morality she had been raised with, the strict, unyielding ethics of her grandmother, screamed at her to throw the card in the trash, take the tip, and run. Jaden was a monster. He destroyed lives. The wealth he commanded was built on the suffering of others. To step into his world was to forfeit her soul. But then, the harsh, brutal reality of her life pushed back against the morality. What good was her soul when her electricity was going to be shut off on Friday? What good were her ethics when she was working 80 hours a week and still slowly starving to death? She looked down at her shoes. They were cheap, black slip-ons, scuffed at the toes, the soles wearing thin. Jaden had noticed them. He had looked right through the polite veneer of her uniform and seen the desperate, grinding poverty she tried so hard to hide. He hadn't judged her for it. He had weaponized it. He knew exactly what he was offering. He was offering her dignity, albeit bought with dirty currency. From across the dining room, Richard emerged from the kitchen doors. The color had returned to his face, though he was still nursing his bandaged hand. He practically sprinted over to Stella, his eyes wide, landing immediately on the leather billfold. "Did they? Is everything okay?" Richard stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the empty booth as if expecting a bomb to go off. "Did he say anything? Is he going to ruin us?" Stella looked at the manager. For the first time in her 2 years of working at Laura, she didn't feel the need to defer to him. She didn't feel the automatic, ingrained subservience that came with the apron. She felt the heavy coin in her pocket. She had handled the monster that had brought him to his knees. The power dynamic in the room had shifted, and they both felt it. The table was satisfied. "Richard," Stella said, her voice cool and remarkably steady. She picked up the billfold, carefully extracting the signed receipt, and handed it to him. She didn't give him the card. That was hers. Richard looked at the receipt. His eyes bulged, practically popping out of his skull as he processed the number written on the tip line. "My God," he whispered, all the breath leaving his lungs. He looked up at Stella, his expression a mixture of profound shock, awe, and a sudden, undeniable fear. "Stella, who are you? What did you say to them?" "I did my job, Richard," she replied simply, taking the serving tray. "I cleaned up the mess." She turned and walked away, leaving the manager staring at her back as if she were a ghost. She moved through the dining room, her senses heightened. The restaurant felt different now. The opulent decor, the sparkling chandeliers, the hushed, wealthy patrons. It all felt like a stage set made of cardboard. It was fragile. The real power, the true, brutal reality of the world, had just walked out the front door, leaving a heavy scent of rain and danger in its wake. Stella pushed through the swinging doors into the back hallway, seeking the quiet sanctuary of the employee locker room. She needed to breathe. She needed to think. She sat down heavily on the hard wooden bench in front of her dented metal locker. She pulled the black card from her pocket and stared at the embossed numbers again. She remembered the mother's words, whispered just before she left. "He is a wolf, my son, but a wolf protects its own. Decide what you are." Was she a sheep destined to be sheared by the relentless grind of poverty until she had nothing left to give? Or was she willing to become something else? She had spoken the language of the old world tonight. She had commanded respect from a woman who gave it to no one. She had caught the eye of a man who owned the city. The choice wasn't just about money anymore. It was about agency. It was about refusing to be a victim of circumstance. Stella traced the numbers on the card, the silence of the locker room ringing in her ears, realizing that her old life had shattered the moment that crystal glass hit the floor. The only question left was what she was going to build from the pieces. The heavy rain had finally begun to ease, tapering off into a fine, misty drizzle that cast a halo around the streetlights outside the restaurant. Stella stood by the side service door in the alleyway, the cold, damp air washing over her face, bringing a sharp clarity to her exhausted mind. Her shift was officially over. She had changed out of her uniform, folding the white apron carefully and leaving it in her locker. She was wearing her own clothes, now a worn, oversized wool sweater and faded jeans, but she felt entirely different inside them. The skin she was wearing felt new, charged with a dangerous electric energy that made it impossible to stand still. She had watched the black SUVs pull away from the curb an hour ago, their red taillights bleeding into the wet asphalt like a wound before vanishing into the city's labyrinth. But Jaden's presence lingered in the restaurant, a heavy, invisible residue that clung to the walls. The staff was still buzzing, speaking in hushed, frantic whispers in the break room, mythologizing what had happened. Thomas, the young waiter, had been sent home early, completely traumatized. Richard had approached Stella before she clocked out, nervously offering her a promotion to head captain, his eyes constantly darting to her face as if searching for a hidden threat. He was terrified of her now. He believed she had powerful connections, that she was somehow protected by the Shadow Empire. Stella hadn't corrected him. Let him think it, she had decided. Fear was a far more effective shield than politeness. She stood in the alley, her hands buried deep in the pockets of her oversized coat. Her right hand was wrapped tightly around the gold wolf token and the black card. The massive tip, her cut of the impossible number Jaden had written down, was safely deposited into her bank account via a mobile transfer. It was done. The immediate threat of eviction was erased. She could walk away right now. She could go home, sleep for a week, and return to her life as a waitress, slightly richer, slightly safer. She could pretend tonight was just a bizarre, terrifying dream. But as she looked down the dark, slick alleyway, listening to the distant, rhythmic hum of the city, she knew she couldn't go back. The illusion of safety had been shattered. The world was vicious, driven by power and leverage, and she had spent her entire life on the bottom, crushed by the weight of it. Tonight, she had tasted the air at the top. She had seen how the world bent to the will of those who refused to be broken. She had spoken the right words, in the right language, and stopped a disaster. Jaden had seen her strength, a strength she hadn't fully recognized in herself until the moment she stepped over the broken glass. You step out of the shallow water. His gravelly voice echoed in her mind, a dark, seductive pull. He wasn't offering salvation. He was offering an arena, a place where her resilience and intellect wouldn't be wasted fetching bread and clearing plates. It was dangerous. It was likely a path of no return. But as Stella pulled the black card from her pocket, holding it up to the dim glow of the alley street lamp, she felt a strange, profound sense of peace settle over her. The terror was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp resolve. She pulled her cheap, cracked smartphone from her pocket. The screen was heavily spider-webbed, a testament to the chaotic, careless life she had been living. She unlocked it and opened the dialer. Her thumb hovered over the keypad. She thought of her grandmother, the Iron Woman of Leningrad, who had taught her that language was power. She had used that power tonight to survive. Now, she was going to use it to conquer. Stella didn't hesitate anymore. She didn't let the doubt creep back in. She typed the 10-digit number embossed on the card, the soft electronic tones of the keypad sounding incredibly loud in the quiet alley. She pressed the green call button and lifted the phone to her ear. It rang exactly once before the line clicked open. There was no greeting. There was only the sound of heavy, quiet breathing on the other end. Waiting. Stella stood up straight, her posture perfect, the rain catching in her dark hair. She didn't speak in English. She spoke in the flawless, aristocratic Russian that had changed her destiny. "Ito Stella," she said, her voice hard, clear, and unyielding. Ja gotowa wiiti is melkovodja. This is Stella. I am ready to step out of the shallow water. The silence on the line stretched for a brief electric second. Then a low, dark chuckle vibrated through the speaker, a sound of profound satisfaction. I will send a car, Jaden replied. The line went dead. Stella lowered the phone. She looked back at the glowing back door of Laura Restaurant one last time, taking in the warmth and the noise of the life she was leaving behind. Then she turned her back to it, walking out of the alley and stepping fully into the dark, rainy night, ready for whatever the wolf had planned. Language is a bridge, but courage is the currency that allows you to cross it. Stella's journey reminds us that the darkest, most terrifying moments of our lives are often the precise crucibles where our true power is forged. When we refuse to shrink in the face of absolute intimidation, we command a respect that cannot be bought or bullied. She stepped out of the shadows and altered her destiny simply by finding her voice. If this tense, high-stakes cinematic journey kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. Share this story with someone who loves a grounded, emotional drama. And don't forget to subscribe for more vivid, real-life feeling stories. What would you have done in Stella's shoes? Let me know in the comments below.